Carried 12-0-0. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Item number 2, Assessor's Report. Good evening. So we keep moving our meeting date, changing the time.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the BET. I'd like to present the assessor's report for 2016. Just a couple of quick notes. First of all, the Board of Assessment Appeals had their hearings yesterday and today, and they have one more day tomorrow.
Excuse me, would you like to turn on your mic there for the cameras?
Yeah, we turned it off for the executive session.
The switch on the top. The slide switch on the top.
Hello?
It takes a moment. You just
There we go.
There we go.
Okay. The Board of Assessment Appeals had their hearings yesterday, today, and they should finish up tomorrow. So we should have the totals for this year's, the 2014 grand list by the end of next week for you all. Just another note, as far as the revaluation is concerned, it's officially underway now. The contracts have all been executed, and the parties, both companies are here, and they are out in the field and starting the project. Okay. Anybody have any other questions?
No change in the settlement.
Oh, but wait till April. We settled, we'll be down into the 20s, 25, I think.
Can I get a motion at the Assessor's Report?
I move that we approve the assessor's report.
second.
Moved by Ms. Tarkin, second by Ms. Stringer. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? That motion is carried, 12-0-0. Mr. Menarski, good evening. Hello, Peter. Controls Report.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. I'll take a little bit of time. Sorry that the report got out so late. It was delayed on a couple of other activities. Spent a little bit of time on the ADP. It's on page 3 of the pages in here. Start out by saying that we're 6 months into the payroll implementation, but more importantly, we're 9 months into the year, and we're starting to run out of time. And I have a couple dilemmas with the dilemma with the parts that are associated to the implementation strictly for the finance. I'm not going to speak to paying the people, issues at the Board of Ed. I'm just going to stick with the issues in finance. The charter says that once you have an appropriation, you can't overspend the appropriation. The first dilemma I have is I have a budget director that's spending a lot of time trying to get the interface work between ADP and the general ledger. I asked Roland, how much time do you spend on this now on average? He's spending up to 10 hours a week on average, where before he didn't spend any. Under the old Munis system, it was seamless and it went straight over. Granted that we always had general ledger issues when we were customized and things would go wrong, but he's spending on average 10 hours a week. We have to have the general ledger interface forced to be working by June 30th so that the departments know whether or not they're within their appropriations and they're not violating the charter. And they need to know in time to come before the BET or the RTM to ask for an additional appropriation. So we're spending a lot of time on that issue number 1, which is the general ledger interface. Roland assures me that we're going to get it done as far as forcing it at a minimum this year so that everybody has an idea of what they spent this year, and then we get to work with the auditors. Issue number 2, it was a little disconcerting, and I sat at a meeting yesterday, I believe it was the HR committee, and I had thought that the vendor file issues had been resolved a payroll cycle or two, and it sounded from where I'm standing, and you've got 2 representatives here, Ms. Kieran and Ms. Weisler, that it hasn't been resolved. And it also is taking away a lot of time from my treasurer, aside from the HR department, reconciling the vendor files. For those of you that don't know what I'm talking about when it's the vendor files, it's the deductions from the employee's check that are paid to third-party vendors. They could be the DB, defined benefit deductions, defined contributions, etc. I asked the treasurers, how much time are you spending on this? She told me that on average she's spending 8 hours a week dedicated to the ADP issues of cash management as far as reconciling the vendor files, etc. So I've got 2 employees in my department that are spending an extra 18 hours just on the finance department issues. The biggest problem I'm facing is that I have a treasurer who told me that she has yet to have aside from one occasion 6 months ago, she has not gotten a check register for the manual checks. That's when you void a check, you reissue a new one. She has no ability to do a bank reconciliation. None whatsoever. So what's going to happen is 6, 7, 8 months from now, when we're sitting in the audit committee meeting and we have the management letter released, the number one finding, which is going to go to the state of Connecticut, is that we don't do bank reconciliations for the payroll rec. We don't have the tools to do the bank reconciliation. So I know it's bad news, and my staff is spending a lot of time on it, but it's important to give you a heads up on what is going to happen. It's inevitable. It's gotten to the point, and my point is we're 9 months in. We've run out of time, basically. And these are going to be management letter comments, internal control issues, and bank reconciliations. So it's basically, I'm not asking you for do anything tonight. You've got 2 dedicated people. You have a dedicated staff working on this. It's really a heads up. And it's really the highlight of the controller's report. I'll stop there for a second if anybody has any questions about the ADP or anything else in the controller's report.
Mr. Finger?
I was just going to add, I mean, there have been a lot of challenges, and I think Pete really captures sort of the 2 critical issues out here in terms of general ledger as well as vendor files. Related to that, there has been put in place a new steering committee, and I know Pete wants to talk about that, but the steering committee now chaired by Peter Tessie and Bill McCursey and people like Pete and Mary Pepe and I guess Tom Klein to try to continue to work through these issues. They're in the process, I believe, of vetting a consultant who has ADP experience, who has some experience with the general ledger, who hopefully will be able to accelerate the process. I certainly don't want to whitewash any of the challenges we have, but I think we're at a juncture where the HR department is planning to add additional resources which are within their budget and capital appropriation. I don't know if Mary Lee has any additional thoughts.
I would just echo how hard everybody on the staff is working to resolve all of these issues. And some of them, we heard about at the Budget Committee hearings, which are not ADP's issue. It's some of our staff who are still getting trained and ramping up and learning how to use these systems. As Nancy said, additional resources are going to be brought on. I know Roland was looking for someone as well. Nancy and I provided to the chairman of the BET and the finance department a set of recommendations in February, most of which are being undertaken. So I think we're doing as much as we can at this point, but I think Mr. Minarski is correct. This will likely be a weakness mentioned in the management letter, and we're all trying to mitigate that as quickly as we can.
Mr. Finger? I have 2 comments on this, Peter. Number one, obviously, when I received from our 2 members a list of sort of strategizing how to go forward, I did send that off to the Office of the First Selectman, and I'm not exactly sure what the status they did, and the town administrator's here. He might have an answer on that. The second thing is, I am concerned with Section 30 of the Charter, and I do recognize we have some special circumstances here. So what I'm going to ask is, the RTM meets in May for the budget only. So I am going to ask for something from the Budget Committee and our board, even if we have to do a special meeting, for all departments to come in if we think there's an issue where they need a transfer or an interim, so we can package it all together and send it to the RTM for their June meeting. So if we want to fit it in our regular cycle, that's fine. Otherwise, I've talked to some of the department heads. I just want to make sure they have an opportunity to say, hey, I'm not really sure where I am, so they can get themselves in a position where they can do an interim or transfers across major object codes so they finish out the year, within the boundaries.
I'm sure they'll appreciate it, yes.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Mr. Drake, Mr. Martin?
Thank you very much for being so frank about this. This is major. And I'm concerned that the management structure has not got clear authority for who's to solve the problem. If we were to say who's got this responsibility, what would the answer be? It's kind of diffuse. It's a little bit Peter Tessie and a little bit Bill McCursey and a little bit Roland and a little bit Mary Pepe and a little bit Kathleen, and that's not a recipe for success, in my opinion. I think it needs, someone with authority to break the ties, make the decisions, and I also think it needs to be elevated more within ADP. I'm sure you've thought about elevating it. You probably have, but to hear the fact that we're not succeeding. We've heard this in HR for months, haven't we, Nancy? Months. And I don't mean to criticize those that are working on it. That's not the point. I think it needs a major escalation within ADP, and it needs clear authority and, a czar. It's a bad word, but someone or a group of people with the authority to make the changes necessary to solve the problems and make it succeed.
I could answer that. Nancy touched upon it, and it's in my controls report. There's a creation of a steering committee. We're meeting tomorrow at 11:45, and what's different about this is that we've got the two key players, the first selectman, Peter Tessie, and the Board of Education Superintendent, Dr. McCursey. And I think to broaden it a little bit we've got the key people there. I think we need a broader assessment before we can escalate as to how to exactly resolve something like that. If I say to you that I have a treasurer that hasn't had with the exception of the very first week, a check register that she could use to do a bank reconciliation.
That's a crisis.
How do we respond to the auditors in 6 months?
You're absolutely right, Peter.
But I think the answer to your question is the creation of the steering committee is the crucial step here.
Can we ask when and how it gets escalated at ADP?
It depends on the issue. And I think, and maybe Nancy and Mary Lee can answer that, I think you have to clearly define who's at fault and how do you get resolved. You just don't simply escalate something to somebody because they're going to come in for the first time and they're going to hear ADP side first. And then they're going to hear us yelling at them over the telephone unless they come here in person. So I think you need to clearly define what the problem is and how it gets resolved and go to whatever level in ADP.
Bill, just to further answer that, at yesterday's HR committee meeting, Mary talked about conversations she's intending on having next week with ADP because there were deadlines set with respect to certain of the items that you see in the controller's report, and it doesn't look like they're going to be met. And so therefore, that next step, I think, is contemplated for next week.
Mr. Norton?
Yes, I want to address the issues of bank and check reconciliation. Is it a procedural issue that's causing the inability to get them? Have we identified what its cause is?
It's, according to Kathleen, the treasurer, it's a lack of training. They're issuing, there is a number of manual checks that are being issued in the place of a void. She's got two issues here. Number one is hundreds of thousands of dollars are being voided. They're originally funding the payroll, gross.
Why? Why are they voiding all these?
Because they're wrong. They have to be replaced. They have wrong dollar amounts. Maybe overtime was left out. They have maybe a certain amount of deductions that shouldn't have been in there. There's a variety of reasons. But the two issues is that the gross payroll is going over. She's funding it. And then when they're reissuing them, they're refunding them. But she's not getting any money back from the original voids. So there's a gap of a couple $100,000 there. The bigger issue with the treasurer is that if you know anything about a basic bank reconciliation, it's the reconciling items, which are mainly in the payroll, are the voids and the manual checks. If you had a payroll go through and it was $10 million and there was absolutely nothing wrong with it, the only reconciling item you would have is the outstanding checks. It becomes harder to reconcile when you have voids and reissues. You have checks that don't have check numbers on them.
I understand that, but it seems like we have procedural issues here to be able to reach the point in which you can begin to do the reconciliation. So it seems that the procedures that lead to that are where the deficiencies exist.
Step one is she needs a check register.
You know, which is a relatively...
Check register has a payee,
You know.
has a dollar amount, and has a number.
That's a simple process.
She doesn't have that tool.
Who doesn't have that tool?
The treasurer.
Well, she's getting it from somebody, whoever's...
She hasn't gotten a check register since the first payroll. I'm talking about the manual check register.
Everything else exists.
Hundreds of checks.
It sounds like we have procedural issues here.
Okay. All right.
I have another question on
Yes.
on this report. In the financial advisory services, we have 4 applicants who've completed the RFP process. Is one of them our incumbent?
For which one? The borrowers?
For the financial advisor.
Retirement board?
No, this is for
Yes.
outside borrowing.
Yes.
An RFA.
One of them is Bill Lindsay in IBIC.
And it says here you're going to be making a decision late this month, internal committee?
No, we're going to, probably the answer is going to be yes to that, but I didn't want to commit to that. We need to do the interviews next week first, and they should be pretty simple. We're familiar, it's the same 4 firms that bid on the job 5 years ago.
Okay, well, who's going to do the interviewing and...
Roland, myself, and Kathleen.
Anything else on the controls report, Mr. Blankley?
So, Pete, would brute force be the answer to this?
I don't know.
What you have in mind?
You know, bring in more hands. Juniors from the accounting firm, just put them to work in a room somewhere, and it's a lot of detailed work, isn't it? Going from check to check, from void to check to new check.
I don't know the answer to that. Anybody else, Mr. Goldrick?
Yeah, not on the subject of brute force, but do we...
We see our extremes.
Right. Peaceful man here. We are withholding hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments from ADP. Are we convinced that this is mainly their fault, or are we heading towards a lawsuit that we might lose, a la the Worth construction thing?
I don't think no on both points.
I'm sorry?
I don't see a lawsuit, and I can't say it's entirely anybody's fault. It's answering the question before you escalate. You make sure that it's not your fault before you start blaming people on the other end.
So should we be withholding these funds from them?
There is money being withheld. I think it was $267.
Yeah, about 270, and I think one of the issues, Sean, is the general ledger interface isn't working yet, nor the vendor files, both of which were deliverables. So I think there's a very good legitimate case to be made that we shouldn't be paying them the remaining part of the contract until this is delivered.
And second question is, in terms of who would be the point person on this, I should think that the information technology department would be, but that appears not to generally pop up in these conversations. Do we not have the right expertise in that particular department?
I think the point people are one of them's in the room. I think Roland is the point person on the general ledger. I told you he's spending 10 hours a week. 10 hours that he never spent before, and we just went through the budget cycle, and it was tough. He's averaging 10 hours a week, working with ADP specialists. He's probably the most knowledgeable person in that area as far as getting resolved. So he's probably ahead of paying a high-priced consultant to help us out, who's going to go through a learning curve. Point person on general ledger is Roland. The point person on the reconciliation is going to be Kathleen. She's spending an extra 8 hours a week she never spent before on the reconciliation. It's her responsibility to do these bank recs. We've been reconciling for years. We've got 20-something odd accounts that we reconcile on a normal basis. She's spending an extra 8 hours. She's been without her assistant since February 5th, who won't be back until out on surgery for another month or so. So she's stretched thin, and she's the point person on the bank reconciliation. As far as the vendor files, you've got Allison Graham, and Roland can assist on that.
So you're saying that
they know they're the ones that are trying to. In the case of Allison, she's fixing it every week. The problem is you're paying for a system, you shouldn't be manually fixing it every week. The errors.
I guess that gets to the point of IT. I appreciate all the incredibly hard work that you all are doing, but should that department be taking the lead on fixing all of this?
I'm going to defer to the two ladies, but I'm going to say no. I don't think so.
I was going to say that came up at the budget discussion, and we were talking, a budget committee, if you recall, and talking with Tom Klein as to sort of going forward, would he have been the lead, or looking back, had he been present the time that this was launched, would he have taken the lead? And I think his view is he brought the technical expertise in terms of looking at the systems and has done a lot of work. I mean, it's not easy to bring a system like this and run it on our servers and make sure you have all of the interfaces. So that's been his job. He's been in basically putting in place the clocks and making sure all the technology works. But I think he doesn't really have the business understanding that Roland would have, Allison Graham would have, or Mary Pepe. So I know in our conversation going back to a year ago, it seems, as we were talking about this at the HR committee, we were saying who is the point person if you were to look to a single person, a point of responsibility. And I think Mary Pepe stepped in and said, I'm the one who's the focal point here. So, I mean, I think there is accountability. I think as we've reached times where we are not moving forward and still have problems, since October, we have put in place, the senior leadership of the town to make sure in many fronts that this is going to work.
Just to follow up, in hindsight, we didn't go through a real parallel implementation, and in hindsight, the vendor files and the general ledger, when we started paying people, were not tested. So when we started paying back October 17th, the unknown, we didn't know about the potential issues of the general ledger or the vendor files or the bank reconciliation. The goal number one was to get out accurate paychecks, which we're doing now, with the exception that you're always going to have a check that's wrong because somebody submitted a wrong timesheet or a wrong request. But the unknowns in cycle number one payroll, nobody was thinking about the general ledger at that time, except for maybe Roland, who might have forecasted or something like that, or felt it was coming. So these things were not properly tested before we went live.
Could I just add to that? They were supposed to be tested. I mean, it was part of the RFP that the general ledger would interface and the vendor files would work. ADP was supposed to be testing those before we went live. And subsequent to going live, the town learned that they were not adequately tested.
Yep.
But there was an intention to test, and there was a requirement to test that existed. I just want to make sure that that's clear. And just to go to Sean's question, technical expertise exists within HR. There was a relatively new hire there, Jamie, who has ADP experience, and I think some of the extra manpower that is contemplated to be brought on shortly will also provide that technical expertise that we don't naturally have in our IT department or anywhere else. But it's a good question. In some enterprises, you'll see a system like this be implemented by the IT group. But because of the lack of ADP expertise and because the project being brought forward through HR and maintained through HR, that's where it is.
Okay, moving along. Anything else on the controls report?
Yeah.
Mr. Raymer?
It's not on the subject of ADP. It does tie into the inquiry that Mr. Norton made regarding the upcoming contract with the pension consultant to the retirement board. At the last meeting, Mr. Chairman, you asked the law committee to consult the town attorney and look
Yes.
at the issue of whether or not the BET has standing, whether it's the appropriate body to review and approve the contract that the retirement board enters into with its pension consultant. We have not forgotten that item. We met with Attorney McLaughlin. He would like to consult further with Attorney Fox, and it'll be reviewed by the committee probably at their next meeting, and we'll get back to you.
Thank you so much. I did have a note on that, by the way. Okay. Can I get a motion the controller's report be accepted? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Who seconded that? Ms. Tarkington. All those opposed? Abstaining? That is carried. Item number 4, Treasurer's report.
Second.
Mr. Norton makes a motion to accept, seconded by Mr. Finger. Discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? That is carried. Trying to keep the agenda light tonight because of our long meeting with the public hearing. I have nothing under item number 5 or 6 or 7 tonight. New business. Mr. Drake, I will call you for the first item.
We have before us the approval of the pension funding policy. We've read it all. It's been reviewed by everyone before and approved by our the Investment Advisory Committee. The essence of it is fairly simple because the charter obliges us to fund the full arc of the pension, and that's the core of what the policy says. So I would move on behalf of our committee that it be in front of us to be adopted as a policy.
That item has been moved on behalf of the Investment Committee. Discussion?
Just a question for Mr. Minarski. So the changes that have been discussed previously have been approved by the Retirement Board? Is that right, Pete?
Yes, in the lower right-hand corner.
Okay.
That's the date of the approval.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yep, and Mary Lee had notable contributions to that. Thank you.
Just one quick comment on this item. I took Mr. Minarski's suggestion to put this on the item. He believed it was ready to go. As far as our OPEB, obviously, the snowstorms were out of cycle. That's going back to the Budget Committee tomorrow night, and we've had some input from our board members and some others, so that's still in progress, so that's why that's not on the agenda tonight. Next item. Oh, I'm sorry. So
Approval of the pension fund.
we have a motion from the committee. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? That motion has carried 12-0-0. Sorry. If you could, I'm going to pass these out. This is, as you know, it is budget season, and I've put together some, I think I have enough here, some committee and district. If you could take one and pass it down, I'll give you a second, and I'll show my thoughts. I did this on short notice. Obviously, if anybody needs to switch, we always want to try to find a replacement. I know Mr. Raymer is taking us on vacation in April.
My apologies.
So Mr. Finger is going to sort of volunteer to do some extra coverage in April, and then Mr. Raymer will return the favor in May.
Indeed, I will.
This is going to be, as I say, this is our chance to reach out. I think there are more topics out there that the RTM committees and districts will want to have a conversation about. So obviously this is an opportunity. Some of the committees, obviously, we send 2 people as a pretty good rule. So because they're usually pretty involved. So if any member has anything, Peter, I have a copy for you and a copy for you. Have one, Roland? I have a copy for you and Roland. They normally have that. So again.
Does that mean you want Roland to go on these meetings?
No. But I do know that Peter does go to. I know you do cover finance. So again, if anybody is going somewhere and they want someone extra to go with them, it's fine by me. I just think it's a good outreach for us, and I think it helps.
For protection purposes? Or?
No. I think it helps with the districts to have the communication. Certainly, we always did this in May, and moving it up and doing an extra month has been beneficial. Mr. Finger.
I saw an email that you sent to Elaine to put dates on these. Will she be emailing around what the dates of the meetings are?
Yes. What it is that she didn't have I got to get her the RTM book, and we'll do that. If you have the little RTM book, all the dates are in the cover on that.
It's probably on the website, too.
Yes, I imagine it is. And I did, by the way, I copied Tom Burns, so he normally has a running email with the committee chairs and district leaders, so he can know they're expected. My feeling is I would try to go to the committee district meetings, say I'm here if you have anything you'd like to talk about. If not, whatever. Okay, under new business, Mr. Finger.
I'd like to make a motion to add a new item to the agenda under new business.
And it's called Fund Balance Discussion.
Analysis or fund
Good.
balance discussion.
I'll second that one. Discussion?
Discussion on the motion. We're discussing the motion to add the item?
Yes,
Okay.
Is there a second on that motion?
Yeah, Mike seconded.
I seconded. Oh, your microphone. What this is basically is I've had some informal conversations with several members about what the fund balance is at particular dates, and I thought with decision day right around the corner, I thought it would be better to ask Roland if he would sort of give us a presentation of the fund balance, the different dates, and what we do. We're not voting on anything, so all those in favor of adding an item?
Aye.
Opposed? That item has passed. It needed a 2/3 vote, but it passed unanimously. So I'm actually just going to leave this to Roland. I have one.
Roland?
Passing it out upstairs, but asking for one.
Roland, could I have it?
Share mine.
You want to use?
You can use mine. You're going to sit here. You might use the mic. It's on there.
So take us through this.
Okay. We start at the top with where we were in the CAFR at the end of June, of last June. And we had a total fund balance of all three funds of almost $46 million. We used 9.7 of fund balance to balance the mill rate for the 14-15 budget. And we funded the risk fund with an additional $500,000. So on July 1, we had $36,700,000 available in fund balance.
That's the current year we're in.
Right. The only notable activity in terms of interim appropriations was the risk fund, and we've had $1.7 million, another $90,000 today, to the risk fund, which brings the risk fund down to 1.7 at the end of the year. I'm assuming that the general fund will have favorable results of revenues and expenses of $13 million. So of that, we're using almost 10 in the mill rate calculation, which means overall fund balance year over year will go up about $3 million.
Roland, I'm sorry. Tell me, what is the $13 million?
$13 million is when you compare actual revenues to budget, it'll be favorable. Spending will be favorable. The two of them together should be about $13 million. So we'll end the year on June 30th of 15 with a fund balance of $48,370,000. And we're going to use another $9.7 million of fund balance to budget the 15-16 budget as it stands right now, and we're going to put $500,000 back into the risk fund. So on July 1 of 2015, we have $39 million of available fund balance. Now that $39 million as a percent of the recommended budget right now is 9.6%. And on the numbers below, you can see how that fund balance as a percent of the budget decreases depending on how much, if any, you want to use the available fund balances for any purpose.
Question?
Okay. Ms. Kiernan?
Roland and Peter, are there any interims expected between now and the end of the fiscal year, for example, snow removal or anything else on the docket?
Obviously, they're not sure about that yet, but they, at least as of now, they think if they do ask for anything, it won't be too much? It's not a significant number as it stands right now?
I'm sorry, the 1.35 interim appropriations is what your estimate is, or that was for last year?
The one,
That's what we've done this year.
That's this year so
that's the
far.
risk fund.
No, the interim appropriations?
Yeah, it's under the risk fund.
Okay.
The only opposite would be in the capital non-recurring, which is not a interim, is the historical tax credits. If we get them back, we owe $950,000 back to the capital non-recurring, so that'll go up by nothing. You didn't factor that.
No, I didn't.
So there would be $950,000 plus if we get the historical tax credits by June 30th.
Which is, we don't know. Okay, Mr. Goldrick was next. I'm sorry.
Yes, Peter, your estimate for fund balance is higher than this one. You have been telling Mr. Mason and me that it will be roughly 52 million, or between 50 and 52 million. Can you reconcile the difference between the 48.4 and your estimate of 50 to 52?
My numbers only went through June 30th. Of
Right,
this year.
correct.
This is on a budgetary basis. My numbers are on a GAAP basis.
Through June 30th.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So on that basis, it's 52
I can
million.
reconcile for you, not right. This is the first time I've seen this document.
First time you've seen it?
I can send it out to you tomorrow.
Okay.
But my numbers are on a GAAP basis. This is a budgetary basis.
Okay. On the GAAP basis, you're looking at roughly 52
Yeah,
million.
The one main difference is that the GAAP basis was about $10 million higher on the fund balance, very first number.
Right. So on,
I think it agrees, again, looking at this for the first time, I think Roland has got a net increase of 3.2 something, so he's very close to my number.
okay, but yours is somewhat higher. And under your numbers, we actually go over the 5 to 10% range in the debt policy, correct? We're over 10%.
I'll send you a reconciliation.
The policy's on a budget basis, though.
Yeah, you're asking, I'm seeing this for the first time. I'll send you my numbers tomorrow.
Okay, seeing it for the first time. So either we're right up at the upper limit or we're over it.
What
Right.
number are you looking for? You're looking, which number do you disagree with?
Not disagree with, but again, fund balance as a percentage of budget. Now, we've got a policy that that's supposed to be between 5% and 10% of the operating budget.
Okay, I have printed out and sent to a number of BET members, all 12 of you, as a matter of fact, the results of June 30th, 2014, which was audited.
Right?
And both numbers were in the nines. I think everybody recalls I sent that number out in, I think, December.
Just last point.
And what I said to you and Mr. Mason was that the general fund balance will increase a few $1 million. So to answer your question is, if this is what answer you're looking for, will it go above 10%? Probably. I can't tell you if it'll go to 10.1 or 11.1 or whatever.
Just last point for, if I may. It stops at the use of that $9.75 million. We don't estimate going forward what we're going to get. Here, the operative figure is, depending on who's telling it, an additional $13 million, $13 to $15 million, while we use fund balance of 9.735. No. And we can expect something like that, or close to that, in the next fiscal year as well, right? So it's going to be in addition to fund balance by this time, by June next year.
No. Okay. Well, let's try this one more time.
Can I just say one thing before?
Yes.
Sean, putting aside what the numbers are, and Peter said he'll give you his numbers tomorrow, our fund balance, whether we like it or we don't like it, some people on this board, it's budgetary fund balance, not GAAP. So Peter was saying that his GAAP number was about 50 million. Roland's doing budgetary, which is what the fund balance is. So from the standpoint of how it plays into the approved fund balance policy of the BET, we need to look at budgetary fund balance.
So let me just tell you the reason for this exercise. We have had conversations about the use of fund balance towards potential liabilities of the town. And the fund balance started at, well, we started years ago at 0. And then we've worked our way up, and, last year we were in the 8s, this year 9, I call it 10. I think we're right at the top of the range anyway. With that being said, I thought it was very important for us to see this with decision day lurking around the corner, so we have an idea of what it is. So for reference point, if somebody said, well, fund balance should drop to within a policy of 7.5% rather than 10, down below you can figure out how much cash you could be willing to reduce fund balance to cover something. So that was the purpose of the exercise, and we had this conversation throughout the budget process when we were doing that, so I just thought that was a worthwhile exercise to do this. So, Mr. Huffman, I think, was first. Nope. Oh, okay, Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, I think that this is important to have this information in front of us. So, thank you for doing this, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Geiger. But I have a question for Mr. Minarski, which you've raised, and maybe not directly, indirectly. When we next look at our fund balance policy, which is on a budgetary basis, should we be looking at it on a budgetary basis or on a GAAP basis? Because originally we set in place these policies because the rating agencies were looking at our financial statements and couldn't understand them. So clearly, when the rating agencies look at this, they're looking at this with other, comparables, and they're looking at it at a GAAP basis. Therefore, Pete, do you have any input at this point in time, or is this something you'd like to think about? Whether
I could answer that. That's
okay.
First of all, the fund balance policy addresses both fund balances. It addresses the budgetary and the GAAP. Okay. And just back up a second. When we do the credit reviews, the credit rating people do not look at the budgetary fund balance. They look at the GAAP fund balance. Okay. That's the one with the 5 components, and the 2 major components are assigned and unassigned. Right. Makes up the bulk of the 40-something million. If you look at the fund balance policy on the GAAP basis, it'll take the GAAP basis fund balance number at June 30th, and what it'll do is it'll reach forward. It'll take the 9.735 and pull it back into June 30th, and they'll take it from assigned to unassigned. From unassigned to assigned. And then the difference in the total in the assigned will be the encumbrances. The major difference between the GAAP basis and the budgetary basis is the treatment for encumbrances. That's why you have a $10 million difference between the $37 million here and the $46 million and change in the GAAP basis that was audited last year. But if you look at the fund balance policy, it's clear. It has both of them with a target range between 5 and 10%, using both fund balances with different makeups and using 2 budgetary numbers. One uses the current year budget, which was just ended, and the other one uses the future year budget. And they almost coincidentally come out to identical ratios. So the answer to your 2 questions is they look at GAAP, the credit rating people, and the fund balance policy already addresses both of them.
Okay. And I had a follow-on question. We're always looking at fund balance relative to our general fund. But, we have a sort of a growing, we'll call it Nathaniel Witherall, school lunch fund, parking fund, et cetera. At some point, will the rating agencies look at these ratios inclusive of these other major operating funds? I want to talk about operating funds rather than just general fund. Or is there any kind of view that they'll look at it any way other than just at the general fund?
Definitely. They'll look at them for different reasons. There's a bunch of funds in there. Let's start with the biggest one.
If this is too complicated for this evening?
It's not complicated at all. But take the pension trust fund, okay? Take OPEB. They're going to look at them specifically, and they're going to look at the unfunded liabilities. That's what's key to them as far as how healthy them funds are. When you go to the risk fund and the capital non-recurring fund, the town of Greenwich takes the point of pointing out to them that we have these reserves. They wouldn't specifically look at them funds as far as what the fund balances were. But because we have a policy that tells them to look at it, and we could say that when we need a rainy day fund, whether it's litigation in the risk fund or whether it's to pay for Hamilton Avenue additional appropriation or MESA additional appropriation or whatever it's going to be, we have our reserve is going to be to turn to the capital non-recurring as opposed to the general fund. They look at the capital projects fund, and one of the reasons they look at that is you could see where it has large negative balances because when we go out to bands, we create negative fund balances. And the reason it is because the financing has been permanently borrowed. And when we permanently borrow, it reverts from a negative fund balance to a positive fund balance. But to answer your question, they look at all of the funds individually and with different degrees. And I would say that the major funds that they're going to look at is going to be the general fund and the pension fund.
Thank you.
Just a quick question for Roland. Does the First Selectman's budget had showed a reduction in capital non-recurring? Is that baked in here?
No, if that stands, that would be an additional reduction in the capital non-recurring fund of $3 million.
So the overall fund balance, instead of 39 and change, would be 36 and change? Okay, thank you.
I just want to follow up. My apologies to Sean for not knowing the answer, but I'm just looking at this for the first time. Roland and I numbers are not that far apart. I was looking all the way down, which I think you were. If you see the estimated fund balance at 630.15, he has it at 48.370, and that doesn't have the 950 for capital non-recurring. So he's very close to mine. I think he's probably more knowledgeable right now in the area of the 13 million, what's going to be returned. I think over the last couple of months, I've said that we're probably going to have $5 million in surplus in revenues. Haven't got a clue on the expense side because of the lack of the general ledger postings. So actually, Roland and I numbers are not that far apart. And I think you were looking at the bottom number, weren't you? The 39 million? Okay.
Okay, Roland, I thank you again.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Goldrick?
I'm sorry, did
I actually was prompted a question. Roland, given that we're having the issues with the general ledger interface, I mean, what's your confidence level at this point? I know it's always an estimate if you're looking out for the 13 million or whatever number that is, but you know, because of the interface issues, is there a much lower level of confidence with that number?
The one, even though we're having trouble posting it, we still see the gross payrolls. And the gross payroll amounts are pretty consistent with what they've been running. So that's not there's nothing there that we see that's out of the ordinary.
All right, Mr. Goldrick, last comment.
Just to sum up, so budgetary and GAAP calculation should be very close. It's a matter of you're not having been able to coordinate on this, I take it. So
well, one of the differences is the encumbrances.
Encumbrances, right.
And the reason that, to me, GAAP is the important number is that we've encumbered these monies because we think they're legitimate obligations. So that if we spend the encumbrances, we don't have that GAAP number actually available.
Okay, but these usually are very close. It's just my point. I guess what I'd like to get to is just one last point, which is we keep growing this figure. 7 years straight of net additions to fund balance, which have taken us to, using this, 48 million and change by June 30th, and we should be looking at another net addition next year. So, Mr. Chairman, I just would like to ask if you are intending to increase the use of fund balance when we go over this on Thursday night, and if you have a figure that you'd like to tell us what you will propose.
I don't yet, no. I needed to see the actual percentage, because after even our conversation the other day, I said, let me just get this on paper here. This is for everybody to start thinking. Yeah, this is for everybody to start thinking. I mean,
well, I've been reading this several times a year for the last 4 years.
Right, but you know, the bottom line, as you say, we've worked our way up to the top of the percentage from zero. From a zero fund balance over 10 years, we've worked our way to the top of our policy, and when we get to the top of the policy, that's when I think we should contemplate doing something with it. That's what we're doing. Okay, moving on. Thank you again, Roland. Thank you. Decision day schedule. For just as a reminder, we are here at 6:30, 6 o'clock,
5 o'clock.
5 o'clock. Just checking.
We'll be done by 7.
Just checking. I just, sleeping bags and pillows, you know, we're going to be ready for all of that. We're going to work off what we call the big sheet. We'll go by departments, and we'll follow that in the normal fashion we do. In normal, I'm going to try to just go by department. We have an enormous amount of conditions and amendments. I'm going to ask everybody in the next 24 hours to try to consolidate. Otherwise, we're going to get in a confusion which one we're working on, because there's several that are the same for the same subject. So let's take the bar and park as an example.
We're going to talk about it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just jump in, part of our agenda tomorrow for the Budget Committee meeting, a regular Budget Committee meeting, is to try to review and consolidate some of those conditions. And I think I've talked to most people on my committee that we're all willing and able to try to do what we can to cull down and try to have a Budget Committee recommendation on some of those conditions, rather than the 42 that we've received so far.
Okay. So we're starting 5 o'clock, and we'll proceed accordingly. Approval of BET minutes, February 17th.
I would move those minutes be approved.
Moved and seconded. Discussion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? Okay. BET workshop minutes, February 19th.
I would move those minutes be approved.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And abstaining. So that vote is 11-01. Mr. Huffman is abstaining on that. Mr. Drake, do you have anything?
Yes, I do. I'd like to propose that at our next BET meeting, that we invite those responsible for solving and completing the execution of the ADP project to give us a report on its status and the action plans to solve it, whether that would be whoever we all think is appropriate, Mr. Tessie, Mr. McCursey, ADP, and the steering committee, whoever we think is best. This issue is so important. We have to solve it together. And we on this board had an important role in setting it in motion and selecting it and recommending it. So I'd like to propose that as a topic for a meeting if it is suitable to the members.
Okay. I'm going to check with our two members on that, and I will get back to you. And obviously, I want to check in with Peter on that. So, Mr. Norton.
No, sir. Nothing.
Under Chairman's report, we have our public hearing tonight. Obviously, so far, we were just talking about the subject releases and conditions. I really applaud everybody for getting them in ahead of time. It really does help. I think we've had a fairly lengthy budget process. Tonight's public hearing is our chance to listen, obviously, and then when we get to decision night, we'll make progress accordingly. Tonight, obviously, I'm going to ask everyone that speaks before us for a 3-minute limit. Fill out cards. Peter, if you would, time, and Mr. Drake is volunteered to try to keep track of the cards. We'll put the subjects together if we can, because some people will come in late. And we're moving along. We're coming to the end, and I can't think of anything else. Is there anything I'm forgetting, Mr. Fringer? Oh, happy St. Patrick's to everybody. So we do have a little bit of a break, which is good, before our meeting. And again, I thank everybody, and I hopefully we'll get through the process and see what we hear tonight. Should be pretty interesting. Mr. Blankley. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you, everyone.